Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Our today's module is namespace in C++ in the paper Object Oriented Concepts and Programming using C++, Information Technology, and the subject is Information Technology. Today we will see about what is namespace, why to use namespace, how to create namespace, how to extend it, how to nest it, how to access the elements from the namespace, etc. So, let us see first of all what is namespace. A namespace actually provides a declarative region to scope the identifiers which are contained in it. The identifiers should have the unique name in the namespace, and the identifiers may be the variables, functions, classes, objects, type name definitions, structures, enumerated data types, etc. Now, why to use namespace? Actually, namespace is providing a method to prevent the name conflict in large projects. In C++, we cannot have duplicate names in the same scope. That means, the identifier should have only single name. We cannot have two identifiers with the same name in the same scope. Now, when the application is very large in real life, the application may be divided into different tasks, and those tasks or modules may be given to different developers for developing. Now, these multiple source files are linked together later to create the actual application. In this scenario, individuals might have declared their own variables or identifiers, and while linking, it may happen that two files may have same identifier names. In that case, it will create the conflict. The another situation where the conflict may be raised is when the application includes libraries. The libraries may be developed by different vendors, so they do not know which names other vendors have used. So, when we include the libraries from different vendors, then also it may happen that the name conflict arises. If we use namespace, it helps us to get rid of this name redefinition error or name conflict, because now we are defining our own user defined scope to have unique items in the namespace. Now, let us see how to define namespace. To define the namespace, the syntax is namespace as a keyword, then it should have the name of the namespace, and in the body of the namespace we should declare the identifiers what we want. Please do remember that these identifiers within the namespace should have unique names. So, it can be seen that it is just like class definition, where the class starts with the keyword class. Here namespace start with the keyword namespace, but the class terminates with the semicolon, whereas the namespace do not terminate with the semicolon. Let us see the example of creating the namespace or defining the namespace. See here, we have created the namespace named my namespace, which have an integer num, which have the function isLib. So, here we have only two elements, variable and a function. Let us see another example of the namespace. Here the variable and the function isLib, as well as we also have a class named point in it, and after that we have declared an object of the class point within the namespace. So, this way here we have four elements: int num, int isLib function, class point, and the object pt of the type point. So, this way we can include the entities with unique name in namespace. Sometimes the functions or the class methods can be declared in the namespace, but defined outside the namespace. Just like in class, the methods may be declared within the class, but may be defined outside the class, just like in non-inline methods. In the same way, as class, here also we need to use scope resolution operator with the name of the namespace. So, let us see those examples. Here again we are continuing with the namespace my name. Now, see here the function isLeap is only declared within the namespace, but it is not defined. It is defined outside the namespace, and while defining we need to use the fully qualified name. So, we have said my namespace colon colon isLeap, colon colon is nothing but the scope resolution operator. So, here also we have used scope resolution operator like the class methods defined outside the class. This is another example where the class is also declared inside the namespace, but defined outside the namespace. So, we can see class point which is declared in namespace my namespace, and while defining it outside the namespace we require to name the class as my namespace resolution scope resolution operator point with the body itself. The functions and class are defined outside the class, but with body. Now, here this is the example where class member is defined outside the namespace. So, we can see void show, which is the third in the class, which is just declared as a prototype declaration in the class, and while defining it outside the class it is not just point colon colon show, but it is with namespace also. So, the fully qualified name will be my namespace colon colon point colon colon show. So, this way we can define the class methods outside the class. So, till now we have seen how we can create the namespace or define the namespace. We can define the full definitions in the namespace, or we can have the function definition or class definition or class method definitions outside the class also, but the prototype declaration should be within the namespace. Now, let us see how we can access the elements of the namespace in the program. There are three ways to access the elements. One is using the scope resolution operator, where we are using fully qualified names. For example, my namespace colon colon num. We can also use the keyword using to import all the elements of the namespace in a particular scope, or we can use the using declaration, where we can import only single element at a time from the namespace. When we use this using keyword, it allows us to use the names without qualifiers. Of course, we can use with qualification also. So, let us see this example first of all, how we can use the element with the fully qualified name with using the scope resolution operator. The syntax is namespace name colon colon element name. The examples are my namespace colon colon num. Here we are accessing the variable. To use the function, we can use my namespace colon colon isLeap. To use the method of the object, we can use my namespace colon colon pt dot show. Here show is the method, pt is the object of class point. To create the instance of the point class, here we have used my namespace colon colon point. Let us say we are creating point instance pt1 with initial values of x and y as 3.5 and 4.5. So, this way we can call the constructor also. Here this is the actual program, the entire program which uses the qualified name. Just to explain how the variables are behaving in a different scope, we have used three variables with the same name in different scopes. Here this example uses int num as a global variable, not required to be initialized, but here we have initialized it with 50. After that, we have created one namespace, say my first namespace, and it has one element which is the variable num having value 5, and the third place where we have declared variable num is in the main function, in the block of the main. So, it is local variable in the block scope. So, we have declared 3 variables with the same name in different scope. The first one is at a global scope, the second one is in the name scope, user defined name scope you can say, where the name of the name scope is my first namespace, and the third declaration is in the block. Now, how to access these elements then? Global can be accessed using scope resolution operator : without preceding anything, without preceding the name of the global namespace. So, we have used : num. The element of the block can be accessed just simply by the name of the variable itself, name of the element itself here num, and if we want to use the num of the my first namespace scope, we need to use the fully qualified name my first namespace : num. You can see the output here, the value of the global is displayed as 50, the value of the num in block is 70, and the value of the num in namespace is 5. So, there is no scope, there is no name conflict here, even though we have 3 names with the 3 items with the same name in a program, because they are all at a different scope. The requirement in C++ is that within the scope the identifier should not have duplicate name, it should be unique. Okay, so, we have already seen how to use the elements with full qualification preceded by namespace name : Now, let us use another way using the keyword using. With keyword using, we can import either the entire namespace, that means all the elements of the namespace into the current scope, or we can have just the part, maybe single element at a time from the namespace. It enables us to use the names with or without qualification. Elements of the namespace are visible from the place of using till the end of its scope. So, if using is used outside the functions, for example, then they have the file scope, or you can say at present global scope within the file, and they will be available in the entire file. If it is used within the block, then its scope will be only within that block. In case we have the same name in the outer scope, then those names are hidden. So, let us see the example of using the directive. When I say directive, we are importing the entire namespace, that means all the elements from the namespace. By importing, what we mean is we are bringing those elements to be available in the current scope. Now, here we have used the directive at the block scope. You can see we have created 2 namespaces named first and second with elements x and y. In the main function, we have created 2 blocks. In the first block, we say using namespace first. When we say using namespace first here, it brings all the identifiers, all the elements of the first in the block 1's scope, and therefore, we can use x and y, the elements of first, without using even qualification. Please do remember, we can still use the qualified name. That means, I can still use first : x and first : y also. Similarly, in the second block, we have imported the names from the second namespace using directive. So, here in the second block, when we refer x and y, they will be referring to the names x and y from second namespace with values 3.14 and 20. Now, as seen, the output will be the 5 and 10 x 5 y 10 from the first namespace and x 3.14 and y 20 from the second namespace. Now, if we remove the blocks from here, that means using namespace first and using namespace second will be in the outer block of main itself. What will happen in this case? Because now x and y of the first are also in the scope of the outer block, and x and y of second are also in the outer block. So, within the same block we have x y x y. Will it give redefinition error? In this case, it will not give redefinition error, but when x and y are referred, the compiler will show the ambiguity error, because it cannot understand now which x and y are to be used, because they have same names in the same block scope. In such case, it is better and even safer to use fully qualified names, because even after using directive, these fully qualified names are still available. Let us see now the using directive at file scope. Here by file scope, what we mean is, it is just like global, but within the file. That means, it is not available in another file. We cannot use extend in another file to have these names from the name scope. If required, we can again use using namespace in the another file. So, this is the difference between global variables or the variables in the global scope and the variables in the file scope. The variables in the global scope can be declared as extend in another file, whereas the variables in the file scope cannot be declared as extend in another file. They are available only within the same file. So, here again we have two namespace, first and second, but in this case we have used using namespace first outside the main function, outside the function. That means, it is at the global scope, in this case it is at the file scope. So, to access the elements of first, x and y can be used just without qualification, but to access the elements of second, because we have not used using, we need to use the scope resolution operator. So, in the function we can see we have displayed the value of x and y without using the qualification name, but from the second namespace, of course, we need to use qualified name like second colon colon x and second colon colon y. So, the output is the first statement cout refers x and y from the namespace first. So, their values are 5 and 10, and obviously, second one is 3.14 and 20. It is not 1416, but it is just 14. Now, example using directive at namespace scope. So, we have seen the using directive at block space, block scope, as well as at file scope, that is the global one within the file. Now, let us see the third way of using directive at namespace scope. When we say namespace scope, it means that we are using the using directive within the namespace definition. So, here we can see we have used namespace second with double x and int y. We have used namespace third with its elements x's and yy, but within it we used using namespace second. So, this way it will import all the elements of second in namespace third. So, now the namespace third will have x, y as well as xx and yy. So, 4 members in namespace third at present are available in its scope. Now, after that outside main we have used using namespace third, which will make x, y, xx and yy all available at file scope. So, in the main function we can simply say x, y, xx and yy to refer them. You can see the output, the values of x, y and xx and yy are displayed as expected. So, using directive can be used at block scope, at global scope as well as at namespace scope. In the same way, using declaration can also be used at all these 3 scopes. Now, the difference between using declaration and using directive is, when we say using directive, it imports all the elements from the namespace, that means the entire namespace, whereas when we say using declaration, it allows us only to import single item at a time, single element at a time. And using Declarative require the syntax, then the name of the namespace, keyword using, then the keyword namespace also. In using declaration, it requires only the namespace name and element name, which are combined with scope resolution operator. Please see here that it uses only using keyword and it does not use namespace as a keyword within it. So, let us see the example. Here again we are continuing with first namespace. So, namespace first have two elements int(x) and int(y) as the variables. After that we have said using first colon y. I am again reminding you, we have not used the keyword namespace here in between. We say using first colon y. That means, we are importing only y from namespace first and not x. Now, again here I have used int(x) as the global variable, also int(x) as the local variable. So, when we refer, there are 3 x, one from global scope, one from local scope and one from block scope of the namespace first. Now, how they are referred, you can see colon x for the global variable, just x for the local variable, but first colon x for the variable in the namespace scope first, and y is referred just as y, which can otherwise also be referred as first colon y. But because it is imported here using declaration, it enables us to use even without qualification name. Now, let us see the using directive and declaration together used in the same program. In this example, again we are using namespace first and namespace second, but within block of main we have used namespace first to import all the elements of the first, that means x and y of first. Now, in the next statement using second colon x, we are importing x from the second namespace. So, here we have within the block x of first, y of first, and thereafter we are saying x of second. The compiler will not give any error, but in this case it will simply override the previous definition of x, that means it will override the x of first. So, first x will not be available directly without qualification name, whereas first y will be available without even qualification name. So, when we say cout x and y, it will refer to x of second and y of first. To refer x of first, we will have to use the fully qualified name, because it is overridden by second scopes x. So, you can see the output 3.1416 from second x, 10 from first y, and thereafter first x is 5. So, this way we can use directive and declaration. Again, both can be used at block scope, global scope or namespace scope. In all the programs till date, we must have used using namespace std before we start the program. This std namespace actually contains all the standard IO library functions, objects, variables, etc., which are required. We all know that cout is an object, and because we have already imported using namespace std in our program, we do not need to use fully qualified name like std : cout. We can simply use cout cin and so on in the program. Till now we have used cout, cin only, not std : cout or std : cin. If we do not import std namespace at the file scope, in that case we will have to use fully qualified names like std : out to display the value of the variable, or to have the input we will have to use std : cin. Now, we can also use declaration to import only single element from the namespace. So, if we say using std : cout, then only cout we can use without qualification name. Okay. Till now we have seen the namespace which is created using some name. So, we were giving the name to our user defined namespace. If we want, we can even create the anonymous namespace. Anonymous, when we say it does not have any name, so sometimes it is also called unnamed namespace. This unnamed namespace can be defined again, but otherwise it is unique only. That means, there can be only one anonymous namespace. When we define it again, the namespace will be extended. Extended in the sense, the other elements will be included in the previous namespace, previous unnamed namespace. We will see the example also. It can contain everything like named namespace. The only difference is anonymous namespace, the elements are available only at file scope. They are not available at block scope, because it does not have any name. We cannot use them with qualification name, or we cannot even use them with using keyword, and therefore, they are accessed just like normal global variables. Of course, the only difference is they cannot be declared as extend, because they are the items of the namespace and not of global scope, or I mean they are not from the global scope. The example here we have namespace, we have defined the first namespace without any name. That means, after namespace we are not giving any name, only keyword namespace and then the body of the namespace. In the first, at the time of first creation, we have two variables x and y within the namespace. Now, later again when I say namespace without any name, and here the elements are xx and yy, in this case the previous anonymous namespace is extended, in the sense now we have 4 items in the namespace, anonymous namespace in this case x, y, xx and yy. As I said, because it is not having any name, we cannot use qualified name, neither we can use using directive. So, it can be simply available, it is simply available as if they are the global variables at the file scope. So, we can simply access them as x, y, xx and yy. What will happen if we have the variables with the same name in global scope or local scope? Again I am reminding you, namespace, the same name in the namespace scope will not raise the problem of redefinition, but while accessing the ambiguity may arise. Okay. Namespace can also be nested. That means, you can nest one namespace into another, but in this case namespace needs to be defined immediately in another namespace. See this example, namespace, namespace outer, the name is given just for better understanding as namespace outer. Now, in outer namespace we have declared one variable which is num1, and within that we are defining another namespace which is named as namespace inner1, again for better understanding, and it has 2 items, float num1 and float num2. That means, namespace inner1 is nested within namespace outer. To access the elements of the namespace here, in this case, if we want to access the namespace outer and its element num1, we can always say namespace outer colon colon num1. If you want to access num1 of inner space inner 1, because it is nested inside namespace outer, we need outer as well as inner in the scope resolution for fully qualified name. Therefore, we will have to use namespace outer colon colon namespace inner 1 colon colon num1 or maybe num2. Can we use using keyword? Of course, because this is named namespace, we can even use the using keyword. To have num1 and num2 of inner space 1, namespace inner 1 in the program, we can simply use using namespace, because we want to import entire namespace. So, we say using namespace and the name of the namespace, but name of the namespace here needs to be qualified because it is defined inside namespace outer. So, we will have to say using namespace outer colon colon namespace inner 1. So, now we can just access num1 and num2 from namespace inner 1 by simply using the names num1 and num2. No need of fully qualified name, but it does not stop us using fully qualified name. Now, let us see how we can use the alias names of namespace. Defining the alias names, that means alternative name of the namespace. Whenever we have very long names of the namespace, or whenever we have deeply nested namespaces, which will create the full qualification name also very large, in such cases we can create the short name by using the alias. To create the alias name, the syntax is the keyword namespace, then the alias name or the new name which we want to give, equal sign, and the existing name. For example, in our case, in the previous example we have seen namespace outer and namespace inner 1 was nested within namespace outer. So, whenever we want to refer the element from namespace inner 1, we will have to say namespace outer colon colon namespace inner 1 colon colon num1. Now, instead of that, if I define the alias, say in this example we have said namespace ns1 is equal to namespace outer colon colon namespace inner 1. That means, whenever we require, wherever we are using namespace outer colon colon namespace inner 1, we can just use ns1. So, this way we can use shortened names in our code. This can also be useful when the name of the namespace is modified. We must have seen the examples of using defined directive. So, defined directive, the one use is we simply define at one place, and then in the code wherever that name is used, it will be substituted by the preprocessor. Here of course, it is not by preprocessor, but still the same purpose can be served here also. So, suppose now in the previous example namespace inner 1 we have used, and if I want to change the name as namespace level 1, in my code wherever I have used namespace inner 1, I need to change it with namespace level 1. Now, instead of that, so here if I define, I am changing namespace inner 1 by namespace level 1 in my program while creating the namespace. So, after that, if I just define the alias name ns1 as namespace outer colon colon namespace level 1, it requires the change only at one place at the name of, at the time of giving the alias name. In the remaining program, the things will remain as it is, like ns1 colon colon num1 and ns1 colon colon num2 will not require any changes. So, this is the effect of using alias name. Extending the namespace. Extending the namespace means we can create the namespace in one file at one part, or maybe in one part in one file and some other parts in another file. That means, some elements may be declared at one place some elements may be declared at some other place. So, it is possible, and then overall we want all the elements to be in the namespace. So, this way we can split the namespace by declaring the elements in several parts. Those several parts may be within the same file or may be across multiple files. Such types of namespace are sometimes also known as discontinuous namespace, because they are not in a continuous place. Now, this is again useful when the large application is developed by more than one programmers, and the programmers want their own names to be used, but maybe they want those names to be shared by other programs also. That means, those names will be used by others also in their program. Then they can simply declare the namespace with the same name. So, one programmer will in their file will declare the namespace with some name, the same name will be used by other programmer also, but the elements within the namespace will be different of in case of programmer 1 and in case of programmer 2. So, the syntax is same as creating the namespace. Actually, whenever we define the namespace, if it is not existing, then it is creating the new one, but if it is existing, in that case it is simply adding those new members into the existing namespace. So, the same syntax will extend the namespace. So, this way please do remember, we are adding the elements into the existing namespace, we are not redefining, or we are not overwriting, or we are not overriding the existing namespace. We are simply adding the elements into it. So, we are extending the namespace. See the example of extended namespace here. Namespace my namespace has one variable named num1. After that again we are defining namespace, but the name is same. So, namespace my namespace, and here it has the element num2. So, actually in my namespace there are two elements, num1 as well as num2. In this case it is in two parts within the same file. It may be across the files also, it may be at different points in the file also. So, when we use the using keyword to import all the elements of the namespace, here we have used using namespace and then my namespace, it will bring all the elements of the my namespace into the current scope. Here the current scope of course is file scope, because it is outside function, and therefore, we can refer num1 and num2 without any qualification, just by saying using namespace. The main thing here is extending the namespace by defining the namespace with the same name again. Is namespace an overhead when we are using it? No, it does not have any runtime overhead. That means, the execution time will remain same, because the conflicts are resolved at compile time only. Namespace, the qualified name, the using directive, everything is handled at compile time. So, there is no overhead at runtime, but of course, when we use fully qualified names or use directives and we have some other names with the same names, in that case it may create the readability problem. That means, the readability will be poor, it will be difficult to understand the program or to read the program, and therefore, it is advised to use namespace only when it is really necessary and not otherwise. Thus, in today's module we have seen why to use namespace first of all, because we want to prevent the name conflict. How to use namespace? We need to create the namespace or define the namespace, and thereafter we are accessing the member of the namespace. To define the namespace, we will have to use the syntax keyword namespace, then name of the namespace and then body of the namespace. To access the elements, there are three ways. One is using the fully qualified name using scope resolution operator. Another is using the keyword where using declarative will import all the elements from the namespace. Using declaration can be used to import only single element at a time from the namespace. Please do remember that whenever we use the using keyword, the current elements of the namespace will be in the current scope depending upon where we have used using, maybe at the block scope, maybe at the global scope, or maybe at the namespace scope. We can also create anonymous namespace. We can nest one namespace into another namespace. We can extend the namespace and there is no runtime overhead, but the readability is poor. So, it should be used only when necessary. Thanks all for being with EPG Pathshala. I hope you must have enjoyed the session. Please practice it to have the confidence. Thank you once again.